Again, there are many other areas where this occurs as well. So things like compliance with labor standards by subcontractors and suppliers in complex supply chains. It's very difficult either for governments or for NGOs who are trying to monitor corporate compliance to do so consistently, especially since corporations can often temporarily adjust their behavior when they know the inspectors are coming. So again, clearly this is a major problem in the area of corruption, that most corrupt behavior, bribe paying, for example, is difficult to observe directly. The people who are engaged in the corrupt behavior are likely to invest pretty heavily in making sure that they're not observed, and governments often have relatively weak capacity or will to monitor the corrupt behavior. So incentives, monitoring, but sometimes you can have behavior where there may be incentives not to comply, but you can monitor the behavior, but it still doesn't seem to occur. So this, if any of you have ever been to Ephesus, Turkey, this is a shop in Ephesus, Turkey. There are actually several shops like this. It's a tourist spot. There are thousands of people there every day. And it would appear that this shop is violating intellectual property laws, right? Because they're saying they're selling fake watches. They're genuine fake watches, by which I think they mean they're good ones. They're not going to fall apart in just a few minutes, but they are selling fake watches, okay? So this is a place where there are lots of police around every day because there are lots of tourists around every day, and they want to make sure that tourists don't get harmed. But for some reason, enforcement, at least of this particular law, doesn't seem to be occurring. So why can you get gaps between even when behavior can be monitored, not enforced? Well, sometimes it's because the people who are charged with enforcing the law may not see that as, that's not an important part of my duties. So, for example, anyone here ever in Washington, D.C. get a ticket for jaywalking? I didn't think so. For using a handheld cell phone? 1. Okay. Still, the ratio is pretty low. Some unlucky people get caught using handheld cell phones, but it's pretty unusual. And in particular, if the people who are enforcing the laws have incentives not to enforce them when they themselves are corrupt, you're likely to get lower levels of enforcement. So this is a cartoon from Malaysia. For a while, police were forced to wear buttons that said, "Saya anti rasuah," and excuse my pronunciation for those of you who speak Malay, which means I am anti-corruption. But it turns out that if you just add an N before the A, it becomes bribe me later, or I'm waiting for a bribe. Clearly police in many cases are a big part of the problem, and corrupt officials may not fear prosecution. Okay, so seventh, so we've talked about incentives, monitoring, and enforcement, and I argue they have to all be thought about together, because you can have a good incentive structure, but if you can't monitor the behavior, or you can't get the enforcers to enforce violations of the rules, then you're likely to get low levels of compliance. But the third category, which I think is important in very many cases, is people don't comply because they can't. They can't, perhaps because they lack resources to comply. So financial resources, they may not be, parents may not be able to afford school fees, for example. Individuals may lack the human capital to get jobs and welfare to work programs in the United States. They may lack physical resources, and as the recent World Bank report suggests, based on work by Mullyanathan and Shafir and others, they may have cognitive limitations which are likely to be particularly severe when people have been in poverty. An eighth source of non-compliance is targets may want to comply, but they don't have control over their own decisions. That can either be because other people are making decisions for them that they are unable to overcome. So, for example, child labor, trafficked women would be two classic cases of that. Or another form of lacking autonomy is if you're addicted. So why don't people stop smoking even though they realize that it's not in their long-term self-interest? They're addicted, they lack autonomy. So what are some potential applications of autonomy problems to the corruption area? Mexican drug enforcement officials, for example, may fear plata o plomo, either I take the bribe, I take the silver, or I will be killed. And for many frontline workers in bureaucracies who may not want to take bribes, but they may face expectations from their superior that they will get a share of some bribe income, and so they feel if they're going to keep their jobs, they need to make the payoffs to their superiors. So again, 8 different barriers, and I would argue that in interpreting any kind of compliance problem, you should view this as being a checklist and saying, how severe is this barrier to compliance in the particular kind of behavior that I'm looking at. Now, obviously, less developed countries face some special sorts of issues in all of the constraints that I've talked about. So in some cases, governments may see for business behavior, for example, low standards, lax enforcement as a competitive advantage that can affect their business. Clearly, many governments in less developed countries have limited state capacity, limited resources, to do things like develop a compliance regime, a set of rules, to offer positive incentives to, for example, send children to school through conditional cash transfer programs, and the capacity to convey information and resources to businesses to get them to do things like formalize. Governments in less developed countries also, in many cases, lack the resources to monitor and enforce behavior. So this is a chart from an article in the journal Comparative Political Studies about the number of labor condition inspectors per million people. And so given the number of labor, in this case, number of people per labor inspector, given that there are 3 million people for every labor inspector in Bangladesh, why is it very surprising that we repeatedly have instances of tragic workplace incidents in Bangladesh? Okay, so sometimes it's just situation that there are high perceived costs of compliance and low resources for compliance. So again, we're going to be talking in the case later this afternoon about formalizing small enterprises, and in many cases, particularly with regard to business compliance, businesses may feel, well, I don't need to comply because I can just buy my way out of non-compliance through corruption. Okay. So 8 barriers, a daunting list, and again, different kinds of behavior face different packages of barriers to compliance. So what can governments do about this? What should they think about in terms of a strategic toolkit for dealing with this very broad array of behaviors that they have to do with? So I'm going to talk about several different strategies. A first strategy, pretty obvious one, you match the instruments with the barriers. So if individuals or businesses lack information, then you try to provide them with adequate information. If they lack trust in government, well, you try to figure out ways to build up trust in government. That obviously is a very difficult, long-term kind of thing to do. But as we'll see in the Medellin case, that's certainly one of the major strategies that Sergio Fajardo used in Medellin. Again, provide adequate resources if inadequate resources is a problem. A second overall strategy you can use is you start with relatively non-intrusive instruments, and then you move up the scale towards more coercive instruments if the less coercive instruments fail to achieve their results. So I've talked about 7 different types of instruments, which generally are arranged from the less intrusive kind of instruments towards more intrusive kinds of instruments. From providing information, not very intrusive, not compelling people to do anything, down to prohibiting or requiring certain kinds of behavior with penalties attached for non-compliance. So let's go through these one by one, starting with the less intrusive ones. Well, remember I talked about with the example of HIV in Thailand that there was a problem with people weren't aware of what behavior was safe and what behavior isn't. So providing information to clarify what behavior is compliant is one thing government can do. This is an example from Indonesia, where let's say the culture of non-corruption is not sufficiently well understood that they think they can count on everybody knowing what is corrupt and what is not corrupt. So the government has created a little app, and you can do a little test for yourself on your cell phone. They provide you with a scenario, and then you have to choose, is that corrupt or is that not corrupt? So it's a little learning tool. In many cases, governments try to provide this information in a simple and timely a manner as possible. So let's take sort of a classic example. For any of you who have ever been to downtown London, know that on many of the streets there is a sign on the sidewalk that says, "Look right." Why is that? Well, that's for people who come from North America or come from the continent and are used to looking to their left to avoid getting hit by a car or a truck. They're operating on what Kahneman and Tversky call their automatic system as they step off the curb and, of course, get hit by a bus coming from a direction other than what they expect. This is a way of triggering your automatic system. But governments can also do things to try to provide information that is more complex, that triggers your reflective system. So in the example in the lower right is a gasoline mileage label that all new American cars have in it on the driver's side. It's timely information because if you're at a car dealer getting in a car to test drive a car, you're probably in the market for driving a car, right? And it provides you with 2 very simple figures that tell you what the gasoline mileage is. So you don't have to look for that. It doesn't tell you have to buy a more fuel-efficient car, but it reminds you if you're interested in driving a more fuel-efficient car and you're test driving the Toyota Prius now, and next you're going over to test drive the Cadillac Escalade, that, well, yeah, in fact, the Prius is quite a bit more fuel efficient than that Cadillac Escalade. In the upper right-hand corner is a picture of some voluntary labels that have been done in the UK. Imagine you're rushing home after work, trying to quickly grab some food for the family, and for every item you're considering, do you look at the very complex food labels that occur on American food? I don't know very many people who do it very consistently, just because it's hard to dig through all that information. And if you're my age, you also have to put on your reading glasses in order to get it because the print is so small. In the UK, they've experimented with very simple 3-color traffic labels, and if something has 3 of the 5 categories are red, that simply tells you maybe I'm going to think twice about getting this kind of food. So we can think about ways of trying to provide information in a way that is simpler. I'm going to skip through a couple of things here because of time, and let's go on to providing admonitions. Okay, so information, very non-intrusive strategy. All it does is provide you with some information. It doesn't say that you should do something with that information. Admonitions go a step further. They say, here's something you don't know, and this is the way that you should behave. So, for example, in combating AIDS for a long time, the ABC strategy, saying avoiding HIV/AIDS is as easy as abstinence, being faithful, or using condoms, the last 2 being fallbacks if you're not going to do the first one, are admonitions on what you should do. Saying no to corruption is an admonition on what you should do. Admonitions can be framed positively to emphasize the benefits of compliance. So, for example, you should use seatbelts because they save lives. If you're pregnant, that it's likely to save the life of your baby. Admonitions can also be framed negatively, emphasizing the costs or risks of non-compliance. So this is the poster that greets you when you come into the Jakarta airport, saying, "Welcome to Indonesia." That makes you feel real welcome. And then right down below it in big letters, "Death penalty for drug traffickers." That is an admonition that stresses the negative consequences of non-compliance in fairly stark terms. Again, admonitions can be framed in a number of different ways, and there's a big literature on under what circumstances you should be using positive or negative admonitions. Another question that has come up recently in admonition campaigns is, should shaming play a role? For example, in the campaigns in India against open urination and open defecation, should people who violate the norm that the government is trying to promote of ending open urination and open defecation, should they be shamed? In some areas, a strategy's been followed of they send the kids out at sunrise to see the people who are engaging in open defecation, and then their names get written on a wall in the village. A very clear form of shaming. And there are arguments both for and against using shaming as part of an admonition strategy. Third kind of strategy that can be used to try to change people's behavior is provide resources to make it easier for targets to comply. So, for example, and resources not based on you're engaging in a certain kind of behavior, it's just resources provided to make that behavior. So not things like conditional cash transfers, but things like school meals. The idea is that these help lower income children learn better. Providing wells and pipe filters to avoid the spread of guinea worm disease. Again, another strategy, particularly with an emphasis on pipe filters and combating guinea worm in Africa. But one caution I have about providing resources to people is that just because the target population wants your resources doesn't mean they share your definition of the problem or they're willing to change the behavior. This is a picture from a village in Uttar Pradesh where the local village chieftain, the Pradhan, learned that, government will pay for us to install latrines in the village. And so here there are actually about 12 or 15 of these, all on the outskirts of the village in an area where nobody lives and nobody goes because they wanted the resources, but it doesn't mean that they were willing to change their behavior as a result of getting the resources. Okay, so information, admonition, resources. A fourth sort of strategy, which has come in particular out of the literature on behavioral economics from people like Thaler and Sunstein and many others, is the idea of manipulating the choice architecture. That is to say, the framing, the range of options that are offered, the ease of options, and then the default conditions, that is to say, what happens if you don't make a choice. And a lot of arguments have been made about the effectiveness of choice architecture. One of the most famous charts is about a registration to be an organ donor and the variation between countries where you have to opt in to being an organ donor, which in this chart is the countries on the left with the yellow. And the countries on the right are countries where you have to opt out of being an organ donor. That is to say, unless you say actively, no, I don't want to be an organ donor, then you are automatically registered as an organ donor. And it's a very powerful graph, but I would also just like to highlight some of the facts that this is a bit of an oversimplification. You have to be aware of the limitations of defaults, because in the case of organ donation in particular, even though somebody's registered as an organ donor, the doctors and hospitals almost always discuss with the families, do you in fact, with the next of kin, want your relatives' organs to be donated? And in fact, this literature, which is this chart, which shows actual organ donation rates per million population, shows that in fact there's much less difference when you talk about actual behavior relative to registration. Registration is an intention. Donation is a behavior. And in fact, wherever there can be a big gap between intention and behavior, choice architecture may run into some difficulties. So in terms of things about thinking about how choice architecture could apply to anti-corruption strategies, well, a number of different ways it could. So privatizing service delivery and reducing monopoly service provision, for example, changes the choice architecture. It gives you choices you may not have had earlier, which make it may reduce the opportunities for corruption with it. So also things like lowering the number of steps required to register a business, and other sorts of behavior where you have to deal with bureaucrats. If you can have e-governance as a way to get around repeated citizen interactions with bureaucrats. If you lower the number of steps in a registration process for business, eliminate things like licensing and price control rules, all of those things are changes in choice architecture which can limit opportunities for corruption.